Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of the Baekdal Plus podcast. Today, we're going to talk about two exciting things. First of all, we will talk about advertising, because there are some very important trends happening right now that has a pretty significant impact on the future of advertising for publishers. Now, I talked about this in one of my recent Plus reports, but in this podcast, we're going to look at some additional examples, and we're going to talk about the trends around advertising as a whole. And then we're also going to talk about how Facebook was fined by the UK for breaching people's privacy in relation to Cambridge Analytica and that whole story. But what I'm going to talk about is not really Facebook or Cambridge Analytica. I'm going to talk about what this means for publishers, because there are some very important messages that both the UK and the EU is telling us right now in relation to how they are going to deal with things like GDPR, ePrivacy, and just how you have to be responsible for your data. So let's get started. It is hot. I know there are much hotter places in the world than right here in Denmark, but right now in my home office, it is 28.7 degrees Celsius. So I have a very nice glass of very cool water in front of me. There used to be some ice cubes in it, but it took maybe 1-2 minutes before they all melted. So yeah, it is summer here in Denmark. Also, compared to places like in the US, we don't have air conditioning. Air conditioning is not actually a thing in Denmark because we're not used to this type of weather. Instead, every house is built to keep the heat in. So last night when it started to get cool outside, I opened all the doors and the windows and I kept them open for maybe 1 or 2 hours. But during that time, the temperature only dropped from about 28 degrees and down to 26 degrees. That was it. 2 hours of airing out my home, and I only got 2 degrees. And then when I closed the doors and the windows again, it only took about maybe an hour before it was back up again. So every single day, it's just hot. There was actually an interesting study about this that came out just recently from the Harvard T.A. Chan School of Public Health. They tested 44 students in terms of how good they were at completing skills, and they found that with simple tasks, the amount of heat didn't really have that big of an impact, but as things got more and more complex, the heat had a bigger and bigger impact. But it wasn't just the heat that was important, it was also the amount of hydration that you had. So if you are in an environment where there was a lot of heat and you are also dehydrated, your ability to complete complex tasks dramatically dropped. So that's why I now have a very cool glass of water in front of me, because doing a podcast is actually quite complicated. Anyway, let's talk about advertising and the future of that. Advertising is on one hand a very exciting topic, but it's also a very frustrating topic to talk about, because the problem that we see today is that advertising and the media don't necessarily mix that well. And one of the fundamental problems when you look at advertising from a media perspective is that the trends point away from the media rather than towards the media. This, of course, is a big problem because throughout most of the history of advertising, advertising itself was always a product created by the media. And to suddenly realize that the media is not really the key element, that is a very, very hard thing to accept. I want to give you an example of this. Think about something like classified advertising. In the past, classified advertising was a really big part of the revenue for local newspapers, and many local publishers considered classified advertising to be something that was supporting the local media space. But look at what actually happened to the classified market. What has happened now is that this market has now shifted to more dedicated channels that don't have any form of journalism on them at all. Think about what this means for a moment. We used to have a classified market that was supporting the role of journalism. But today we have the same market without any form of journalism at all. What that means is that the journalism aspect of the classified ad space did not actually have any kind of effect. As a local newspaper, you might say that, well, we were creating a lot of very good articles. We were covering important stories. We were keeping local politicians to account. We were covering the local sports teams really, really well, and we were the center of the community. But as you can see today, none of that mattered. So what happened to the classified ad space is kind of the preview for what is currently happening to the rest of the advertising space. And that is that advertising does not actually need journalism to work. This is the key thing to understand about the trend that we are seeing today. As a newspaper, what you do as a journalist only affects advertising if you're creating something that is beneficial for the ads themselves. What that means is that as a publisher, you need to create what we call purchase intent. And this is where we start to see the problem, because if you look at newspapers and you look at the coverage that is usually in the newspaper, what you will find is that most of the articles that you create today does not actually create purchase intent. For instance, if you go to a newspaper and you read about political news or crime or local corruption or other things like that, none of that really makes any sense. In my latest Plus article, I illustrated a couple of examples of this. One was from the Washington Post that at the time was writing about how the US was separating immigrant children from their parents. Now this is an incredibly sad story, so what kind of ads would work well with that? Well, the answer of course is that no ads work with that. As a brand, you don't really want to associate yourself with the news because the news is pretty bad. In comparison, we see sites like Google Search. And when people go to Google Search, it's because they're looking for something specific. So if I'm specifically looking for a new yoga mat, I would go to Google Search, I will type in yoga mat, and here I will see tons and tons of ads for yoga mats because that specific moment and that specific environment creates the highest level of purchase intent possible. Now, I have talked about this on a number of occasions because it ties into what we call brand safe advertising. Many people in the media industry think that they are creating brand-safe advertising spaces because they are traditional newspapers, but the reality is quite the opposite. While Google is certainly not perfect, overall, Google is massively more brand-safe than what you see in newspapers like the Washington Post or the New York Times or the Guardian or any other type of newspaper. The problem is not the quality of the news. Your journalism is really, really good. The problem is the news itself, the things that you write about. And if you spend all your time writing about the problems in the world, you are by definition not creating a brand-safe environment for ads to be in. So the trend that we are seeing is that more and more of the advertising budgets are moving away from newspapers and into non-media channels. Because those non-media channels create a far higher level of purchase intent and therefore also a much better brand-safe environment than anything that you can offer as a newspaper. And this is a big problem. A similar problem is what we see with magazines. Most magazines have a much better editorial focus in that you're covering a specific topic. For instance, a gardening magazine is covering, garden, and a fitness magazine is covering fitness. Because of this, magazines have, by default, a much higher level of purchase intent just in general than anything that you see from newspapers. So that is a good thing. The problem is that magazines are also designed to just be random articles. So even though you have a gardening magazine and you only write about gardening things, the way you write about it is to just have a lot of gardening related articles that you put out every single month. And here again, we see how things are changing. Because when you look at other forms of channels, what you see is that the editorial focus is no longer enough. If you go to YouTube, for instance, and you find people who are really into gardening or some other type of topic, you will find that the topic, in this case gardening, is then mixed with their individual passion and their innovation and all the other passions that they might have. So you have the editorial focus plus a personal connection, or what we in the industry now call influencers. And again, we see how important this shift is, because if you are a publisher and the only thing that you have is just a editorial focus, you will be completely outcompeted by everyone else because they have a focus and they have personal influence. So the competition that now exists around advertising has just exploded, and the things that you need to do in order to make advertising work is just many, many times higher than anything you've seen before. Now at this point, we get into a kind of a trouble, because from a trend perspective, what we see is that the value of advertising is dramatically going up. And if you want to stand out and if you want to keep having a share of the advertising market, you need to be an influencer and you need to create purchase intent and you need to create safe environments. The problem is that most brands today still don't know who they are, and they will probably never know that. I'm reminded here by what it was like when I was working at a fashion company. Now, the fashion company that I worked for was a very big company, and we had a number of big brands. But the problem was that most of our brands were kind of in the middle range of audiences. So they were not too cheap and they were not too expensive. Now, these types of brands, generally speaking, sell very well because it's the kind of clothes that you want to buy, but it's not too expensive for you to really choose. So you get a lot of this middle type of sale. This, for instance, is what you see at sites like H&M. H&M is a perfect example of this middle range of fashion where not being too specific and also not being too cheap gives you a very big market. The problem is that when you are in this market, you also have a very, very hard time defining who you are. So at the fashion company that I was working at, we were constantly confused about who our target audience were. And because of this, our marketing team was hiring outside agencies to do kind of market research studies to define our target audience. The result of this was always pretty useless. They would come back with a kind of a target market definition saying that we were reaching buyers between 25 and 45, people who like to go shopping, who might have a family, who may have an urban lifestyle, who are drinking coffee, sometimes with friends at coffee shops, but only in the big cities. Now, that kind of target definition is completely useless because you can't really design a marketing campaign around it. So, as the fashion company that we were, we had a real problem every single time we wanted to target something because we didn't know who to target. As a result, what we did was the opposite. We just tried to be everywhere. So we would put our ads in most of the large magazines and in some of the newspapers, sometimes on TV, although in Denmark, TV advertising is not really as common as what you see in other countries. We would also put our advertising on taxis and on buses, on outside billboards and in the cinema and even at coffee shops. Because remember, some people were drinking coffee. So we created these kind of leaflets that we would partner with coffee shops and they would just place them on the tables around the coffee shops. In other words, we would just be everywhere. And if you do this at a big enough scale, it actually kind of works. So our marketing strategy back then was not really to target anything, but just to have our name out there. And for us, we reached a rather staggering level of an 89% awareness rate for all age groups and all genders. Now keep in mind, we weren't selling our clothes to all age groups and all genders, but because of our very, very wide marketing campaign, we would reach everyone. Now you see this a lot today when you look at advertising. Many companies don't really understand who they should target, and because of that, they just keep creating massive campaigns where they spread their messages to as wide an audience as possible. But this also has a kind of a negative impact on the media, because in the past, most of this advertising spending would go to newspapers and magazines because you were the ones who dominated most of the market. But today, newspapers and magazines only define a very small amount of the market. Instead, if you really want to reach a lot of people in a very wide way, the most effective way to do that today is just to spend your money on the big platforms like Google, Facebook, or Amazon. What they offer is the widest possible reach, and then on top of that, with sites like Google Search or Amazon, you also have this extra level of intent that is very, very important for brands to have. Now, what you see here is exactly the same trend as what we saw with classified advertising. When classified advertising moved away from local newspapers, they did so because by creating a more dedicated platform just for that, they could create a wider space for people to advertise. If you just wanted to sell your bicycle, why limit yourself to only the people who read a local newspaper if you could instead place it somewhere where people would go specifically to look for this, and also a place where people from all over the country, or at least all over a much larger area, would come to look for it. So the advertising space that we see today is following exactly the same trend as what we have seen before. And for publishers, this is not necessarily good news. So what should publishers do about this? Well, the reality is that if we look at the trend as a whole, the shift that we see in the advertising space away from the media is just going to continue. But obviously, it's not going to go away completely. Instead, what will happen is that the media will just become yet another channel. The same way as when I was working at a fashion company, we would just place our ads everywhere. The media is now just one of those everywhere channels. The outcome of this, of course, is that the total market potential for advertising in relation to publishers is going to be much smaller than what it used to be. And this is something that's going to happen no matter what. However, the place where publishers can still make a difference is if you take that step up and you start to rethink what advertising is. If you can somehow convince brands to advertise with you for a specific purpose or for a specific outcome, you'll be able to get back some of that premium advertising that you used to have. What's important to understand about this is that once you try to do this, it's no longer about reach. The arguments that you once used that people should pay premium ad rates because you were a publisher, that just doesn't work anymore. What you need to do instead is to think about the purchase intent that you can create. And basically what you have is 3 levels. The most highly valuable level is the purchase intent that creates direct sales. In other words, if you can reach people only when there is a very high likelihood for a sale, and if you can create those environments where that specific outcome is possible, that's when you can start to sell this ad space as a premium thing to offer. To do this, of course, you can't just sell people exposure. You have to sell intent, which also means that as a publisher, you have to create a purchase intent. To do this, you need to do a number of things. First of all, you need to understand what kind of need that you are creating at any specific moment. So if, for instance, you are writing an article about something, what specific need does that create? And how does that link to something that people would be willing to buy? The problem, of course, is that when I talk about this, as a journalist or an editor, you're already thinking that this creates a massive conflict of interest in that you now have to write your stories in a way that pleases the advertisers. But one of the things I like you to do is just to go to YouTube and look at what the most inspiring people do on that channel. What you will find is that when they talk about passions and needs, they're not really talking about it in relation to here's a product from a brand. They're talking about it in a way that illustrates that this is something that they are personally, truly interested in. And that's the difference. As a publisher, the problem we have with publishers is that you are trained to not have a personal interest. Because in traditional form of journalism, this was very important. And for some things in the world, it's still very important. If you are covering politics or crime or political corruption or local issues that are affecting your community, being neutral and objective and not adding your personal opinions into the mix is very, very important. But if you are a gardening magazine, being truly massively passionate about gardening is part of what makes you a great publisher. So even if you didn't have any advertising at all, what publishers need to do is to learn how to have personal passion about things and how to express that throughout what you do. And what you will realize is that once you start doing that, the advertising suddenly starts to work as well. So this form of direct sale is obviously the highest form of value that you can create, but it's not the only form of value. As I said before, brands often don't know how to define their own market. So one of the things you could do is that you could also offer them what I would call extended audiences. An extended audience is when you reach people who have less of a likelihood of a direct sale, but you're reaching people with a higher level of reach. So think about this in relation to, for instance, a fitness magazine. Imagine that someone wanted to sell a yoga mat. The direct sale would happen in relation to your own yoga articles or your yoga training sessions or all the other things that you did specifically related to yoga. But that doesn't mean that yoga is the only place where you could sell a yoga mat. In fact, with fitness, yoga mats can be used for a lot of different things. So your extended audience is when you offer brands the ability to reach people outside of the space of yoga, but still related enough to be relevant if you're selling a yoga mat. Now, what's important to understand about extended audiences is that this is not as valuable for the brand as the direct audience, because the direct audience creates a very direct level of purchase intent, whereas the extended audience don't quite reach that level. Finally, we have the next step down from that, which is when we talk about brand awareness. This is a form that most brands offer today. If you go to a magazine and you're just selling reach, what you're actually selling is just brand awareness. As I talked about before, brand awareness is useful in some cases, especially if a brand doesn't quite know what it is they want, but it's also much less likely to make a direct sale. So brand awareness is important by itself, but it's also the least valuable form of advertising that you can offer. So as a publisher, what you want to do is you want to offer all of these three things: the direct sale, the extended audiences, and the brand awareness sales. But what you also want to do is you want to make sure that as much of the value that you create and as much of your editorial focus and the way you think about your journalism is shifted towards the direct sale model. Because that's the only place where you as a brand today can really stand out and make a difference. So this is the overall trend that we see in relation to advertising. We see a very clear sign that the advertising space is shifting away from the media and towards more non-media channels. We also see that when brands are just doing very wide generalized advertising, most of that money is now going to be spent on channels that can offer that exact thing, being Google or Facebook or Amazon or other similar channels. As a publisher, that market will still be there, but it's going to be much, much less. So as a publisher, what you're faced with is this new reality where if you just focus on advertising in general, you're just going to be one of the many channels that people can choose from. And a lot of those channels are going to be non-media channels that don't have the limitations that we have as publishers because of our journalism. Again, the value of your journalism is very, very important from a journalistic perspective. But the journalism does not necessarily create any value for the advertising. So what publishers are left with is the market of very high value form of advertising, where you're focusing on delivering very specific type of results. But to do that, you need to create a very high level of purchase intent. And this is what people are doing on YouTube, for instance. If you look at the most successful YouTubers, that's what they're doing. They're creating an environment where with their focus and with their passions and all of those things, they create something where people want to buy the things they talk about. Not necessarily because they advertise it, but just because of the passion that exists around it. As a publisher, you need to redefine your editorial focus to do the same thing. And for some publications, this is going to be a lot easier than others. The ones who are going to struggle with this the most are obviously the newspapers, because as a newspaper, you don't have any specific focus, and your journalistic focus is not really brand safe. Whereas if you are a niche magazine about something specific, especially in relation to people's hobbies or people's passions, you can really make a difference, and you can start to create much higher level of partnerships. So as a publisher, shift your mindset into thinking like this. But enough about advertising. Okay, so let's talk about this fine that the UK issued to Facebook. Or rather, let's not talk about Facebook or Cambridge Analytica as such. Let's instead talk about what was actually fined, but also how this applied to other people, most noticeable to a site called Emma's Diary, who is basically a publisher creating articles about parenting and pregnancy and things like that. Because what the ICO, or the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, did was very, very important to understand in relation to where these things are heading in Europe in terms of privacy and GDPR and ePrivacy and all that. So first of all, one of the very important things to understand about what was happened was that Facebook wasn't actually fined for giving data to other people. That was not really what the fine was about. Instead, Facebook was fined basically because of three things. Most notable, Facebook was fined because of the problem in relation to friends' data. Now, if you don't know the story, let me very briefly summarize. A researcher in the UK, Dr. Kogan, created a Facebook app that when people used it, allowed him to tap into Facebook's API and to get all their information from their news feeds and their metadata and all those things. But it didn't just get the data for the people who used the app, it also allowed him to get the data from all the people that they were friends with. What ICO is saying is that this is not okay, because even if Facebook can claim that they have consent from the people who use the app, that consent obviously doesn't apply to their friends. So the ability for a researcher or anyone to tap into Facebook's API and to get friend data is something that the UK privacy protection agencies are now saying this is not acceptable. You cannot give other people the right to data. Consent has to be from the person who gave that consent. The second thing that Facebook was fined for was that Facebook did not take care to make sure that Dr. Kogan knew and understood what he was allowed to do. Now, it's important to remember here that Facebook didn't actually allow him to do what he did. When people access the Facebook API, you are limited to only using it to basically create what Facebook calls a better experience. You are not allowed to use it to commercialize it or to sell it to someone else or to use it for creating political targeting and political corruption. Even back in 2014, this was something that Facebook said, this is not okay. You can't use it for this. The problem was, and what ICO points out, was that Facebook did not take enough steps in order to make sure that the partners fully understood and had accepted this. Another problem was that when Facebook realized that they were doing something wrong, they updated their API from API 1 to API 2. This happened back in 2014. And when they did this, they told app developers that they would get a year to become compliant. Now, one of the problems with this app that Dr. Kogan had made was that it was clearly breaching Facebook's terms of use. So when Dr. Kogan tried to apply for the new API 2, Facebook turned him down. But what they didn't do was they didn't stop him from using the API 1. Now that is obviously a very big problem, because if Facebook knew that something was wrong, why did they allow him to continue to use the old system if they've already said he couldn't use the new system? So one of the things that ICO is saying is Facebook knew that this was not okay, but they still allowed him to do it. And that's part of why they're now getting this fine. The third element, which is not really very well defined, is that ICO is saying that Facebook is fined for not being transparent enough. The problem, of course, is that this is a very vague definition of things, because how do you define when you have enough transparency? So even though ICO is saying this, it's a very weak point that they make. I also want to point out that Facebook hasn't actually been fined yet. What the ICO has done is they have issued a letter of intent saying that they plan to fine Facebook £500,000. Now, mind you, for those of you thinking that £500,000 doesn't sound like much, you're absolutely right. It's a ridiculously low amount of money, but at the time, it is the highest fine that ICO can issue. So ICO isn't letting Facebook off cheaply. They just don't have the ability to give them a higher fine. Now, of course, this has already changed today, because if this has happened today, GDPR would have allowed ICO to issue a much, much bigger fine. So the size of the fine is kind of irrelevant. Now, the important thing to understand here, though, is that yes, Facebook is fined for giving someone else access to friend data. But most of what is happening here is that Facebook has been fined because they allowed someone else to do something, even though Facebook has specifically told them not to. I just want you to stop and think about that for a moment. Facebook has been fined because someone else did something against Facebook's terms of use. This is a pretty significant thing, because try to imagine that in relation to publishers. Imagine that you have allowed a third party to track people on your site, and then that third party, against the contract that you have signed with them, decides to do something they're not supposed to. What the ICO is now saying is that as a data controller, you suddenly then become responsible for that. You can't just point to the third party and saying, oh, it was not us who did it, it was someone else, and they broke our terms of use, so we are in the clear. What the ICO is now saying is that this doesn't matter. As the data controller, you are responsible. So if one of your partners do something they're not supposed to, you will be the one who get fined, even if you've told your partners that they couldn't do it. Again, just think about that for a moment. As a publisher, how much in control are you really when it comes to all those third parties that you have put on your site? If I go to my local newspaper, for instance, they are asking me if I want to give consent to 200 different third-party trackers. So, do you know what those third-party trackers do? Are you sure that they are not going to take this data and use it for something they're not supposed to do? Again, you can't just claim that you told them not to. Facebook has been fined because someone did something against Facebook's terms of use. This is a really big thing. And it's a kind of a chilling message for ICO and also the EU in general to send about privacy. When it comes to things like GDPR and ePrivacy, they're not messing about. They are saying, as a data controller, you and only you are responsible. This leads us to the second part, which is the nature of consent. Now, during this investigation by the UK, one of the things that Facebook asserted was that they weren't actually violating people's privacy because people had already agreed to their data being used in this way. Specifically, what Facebook said was that the data about users' Facebook friends was only collected by the app if the privacy setting adopted by those Facebook friends permitted such collection to take place. So basically, Facebook says people have chosen to allow this because it says so in their privacy settings. But what the ICO is saying is that this is not an acceptable form of consent. I will quote their specific ruling on this, and it says, "It was unfair for the Facebook companies to rely on Facebook users' privacy settings as enabling apps installed by the user's Facebook friends to collect extensive personal data from the user's account. The Facebook companies ought instead to have ensured that before access to such personal data took place, the Facebook user was informed that the app wished to access such personal data, was told how such data was sought and how it would be used, and was given the opportunity to give or withhold their consent for such access." Now again, just think about this. What the ICO is saying here is there is no such thing as a generalized consent. You can't just have a privacy page where people are just giving consent to everything and then think that is legal. the actual consent has to be specific for both the user and for the app and for the purpose of which the data is being used. If it's not specific, you don't have consent. Again, this is a really, really important thing to publishers to understand, because right now, if you go to a publisher's site, you will find these consent dialogues that says, this site uses cookies to improve your experience and to deliver personal advertising. You can opt out anytime or find out more by reading our cookie policy. Those kind of messages are completely illegal, and it's because of this exact thing. You can't get a blanket consent to 200 different tracking cookies. That's not a thing that the ICO will accept as a reasonable form of consent. Now this leads us to MS Diary, which is even more important because MS Diary, as I mentioned before, is kind of like a publisher. Now, MS Diary is a pregnancy/parenting site, and it publishes articles, it has a web shop, and it has a kind of a member database of about 1 million people in the UK who use this site every single day. What MS Diary did was that they took this user database and they sold that to Experian, which is a known data broker, who in turn sold it to the UK Labour Party, which is a political party in the UK. And what the political party then did was that they looked at all this data in order to figure out how to create tailored advertising. What the ICO is saying is that this is in no way acceptable. Just because someone is using a site about parenting, people would not expect that this data would suddenly be turned into a kind of a political targeting form of mechanism. Again, it's very, very interesting how the ICO is framing this. MS Diary, just like Facebook, try to defend their use of this data. And they said, all data supplied agree to be contacted via the postal channel or by third-party marketers, and the usage of the mom's data is fully outlined within our privacy policy. So basically, what they're trying to do is the same thing as Facebook. They're saying that, well, when people signed up, we had a privacy policy that people had to agree to. And because they agreed to that, we, in this case being MS Diary, is allowed to use this data in this way. But what the ICO is saying is that this is not a legal form of consent. First of all, they point out that in the privacy policy, MS Diary never specifically defined that the data could be used for political targeting. Now, MS Diary did say that it was used by third parties, but by not being specific about it, ICO is saying that it doesn't apply. As they say, LCMB's, which is the company behind MS Diary, LCMB's privacy notice gave no indication that personal data may be shared with the Labour Party or indeed with any political party or for the purposes of any political marketing. Based on the information LCMB provided, data subjects would not have foreseen that their data would be shared within a political party as described above. So here, ICO is telling MS Diary that because they fail to be specific about the data used, they don't actually have consent. Again, this is really, really important to understand in relation to both this specific ruling, but also GDPR in general. You have to be specific. You can't just say, we are going to give this data to third party and they're going to use it for whatever they use it for. You have to very, very specifically outline what it is that the data is going to be used for. But it actually goes even further than that, because ICO then starts to talk about fairness. Fairness is a legal term in terms of data protection in the UK, and there is very similar wording in terms of GDPR, and it relates to what people would reasonably expect when they do something. And what the ICO says was that MS Diary did not live up to the rules about fairness. Again, I will quote for what they actually said. Controllers were required to provide or make available to the data subjects information about the purpose for which their personal data will be used. LCMB, again, that's MS Diary, failed to comply with that transparency duty in this case. It did not provide or make available to the affected data subjects information about the potential disclosure of their personal data to the Labour Party or to anyone else who might use that data for the purpose of political marketing. The fairness requirement under GDPR, which is the regulation that applies to this, also includes a substantive duty to treat individuals fairly when using their personal data. In particular, fairness involves adhering to individuals' reasonable expectations of how their data will be used and not using their data in ways that risk causing them damage or distress unless there is some sufficiently weighty justification for doing so. LCMB failed to use the personal data of the affected data subjects fairly in this case. What this means is that even if MS Diary had specifically pointed out in their privacy policy that the data might be used for political targeting, it would still be illegal because it would not be fair for people using a site about pregnancy to also expect that this data would be used for something completely different. Now in GDPR, this is a specific thing called data minimization, that you are not allowed to use the data for something different from what it is that you offer. It has to be specific. Now again, think about what this means for you as a publisher. It means that even if you have consent, that consent is not legally binding if you start to use this data for other things. So as a publisher, you cannot use data for anything else than what you're offering people in return. If you are a pregnancy site, you can collect the data in relation to pregnancy, but you can't use the data for anything else. And the same thing applies to any of the third parties that you have on your site. So you can't just give the data to Google or Facebook or some other company that you have on your site, and then they can then use that for whatever they want, because that would be illegal, because it's not a fair use of the data in relation to what people would reasonably expect. So this entire ruling is extremely important in relation to how publishers should think about the future of GDPR and ePrivacy and all the other things around that, because we are dramatically moving into a new world of data. And a lot of the things that seemed normal before and a lot of ways that you are doing things today is already massively illegal. Every single consent dialog box that you have as a publisher today, where you're just asking people for blanket consent and you're just giving this data to third parties, those consent dialog boxes are not actually legal if anyone, either being you or any of the third parties that you are partnered with, starts to use this data for something else. And as you can see from this ruling, they didn't just fine Facebook for this. They also fined a publisher. So this is happening right now. And as I've said many times before, my advice to you as a media analyst and as a consultant is don't wait to see what happens. We already know what's going to happen here. And you need to very drastically rethink the way you think about privacy, because this is only going to get worse. And when we look at the future of privacy, which is coming with ePrivacy, it's going to get even worse. I want to give you a short taste of this. I will probably talk about this later. But in the ePrivacy draft, the EU is talking about things like spyware and malware in the same sentence that they're talking about tracking. So the EU thinks about spyware and third-party trackers as being equally bad. That is a really strong message for the EU to send. And as publishers, you are the ones going to get hit by this the most. Now, I will put up the links to all of this in the show notes of this podcast and on my site so that you can read what the ICO is saying specifically. And I would actually advise you to do that. It's not a very long document. It's probably take you half an hour or something. But there are 3 documents that you should look at. There is the overall document about the ruling from ICO. And then there are the 2 letters of intent that they sent to Facebook and to MS Diary. And it is really an eye-opener in terms of how serious they think about privacy. So please take the time and read over these 3 documents. It's very fascinating. You can skim over the part about Cambridge Analytica and the political things. Obviously, if you're a journalist, you might want to read that anyway, but it's very important and quite fascinating reading. And with this, we have now reached the end of this episode. I hope you liked it, and I hope it was useful to you. And as always, remember to tell your friends about it. As I've said before, the only reason why I'm able to create this podcast and do the things that I do is because of my Plus subscribers. So please tell your friends about it. Get your friends to listen to the podcast, but more importantly, get your friends to check out Baekdal Plus and hopefully also subscribe. It really helps. And as always, thank you for listening.
I'm on my way now.